first thing to do with all these things is to get all the kit to work. So hopefully bear with me for a second while I do that. Oh, there you go. It's all working. Well, it's good to see a lot of old friends and indeed quite a number of people in the audience who've been not just peers but sort of the super peers, if you like, people you've looked up to into the industry. So thanks very much to David for the chance to sort of give a bit of a view. And I think the way I'm going to do this, whilst there's sort of headings and there's a sort of formal structure, if we sort of deal with this as a sort of more in sort of comments really on where we are in the industry, I think we'll probably get a bit more knowledge out of the old noddle. Just start off with a comment, and actually it's interesting that the Apple phenomenon comes up. Yesterday I was in a meeting with a finance guy that we were put on to talk to, who was asking this question of what's going on in the geophysical industry. Why do we have outstandingly successful companies drilling first wells in basins like Tullow, or the whole East African phenomenon going on? And it's a good question because it's creating huge value, and we've seen deals happening in the market that are sort of reflecting that. His comment was, apart from the sort of whole Apple consumer electronics business, the outstanding area, and this is a guy who's got 10 billion under funds in companies that we all know here. His comment was that the area where technology is adding most, in his opinion, is in our area, is in the upstream oil and gas business, and it's the potential for not just exploration but also appraisal and production value add that really is the deal here. So I'm going to try and reflect that in the talk and give a few case studies. Some will be fairly standard to people who know our business, the rock physics, AVO and inversion business. Move through some quirky sort of things, the hydrodynamic seismic attribute story, just putting rocks, pressures and fluids together, which is an interesting combination. Then time lapse and real time, which I think there's a talk, Stingray giving a talk, and that will be very interesting to sort of bolster that. Geomechanics, again, this area where we're putting together pressure, fluids, time, and if you like, stress, more and more dynamic properties coming together. And then I'm going to summarise the way it all looks. So just a few bits. Why me, if you like? Why me? Well, we're sort of in touch with a lot of different issues and problems around the world as a business. We'll just highlight a few. Heavy oil, which is surprisingly sophisticated considering you just think it's sort of digging stuff out the ground almost. You've got multiple time-lapse, SAG, water injection, mapping temperature, fluid fronts, really quite a sophisticated business out in the oil sands. Gulf of Mexico, the pressure business, if you like, is very large there given the Macondo event. That's an aspect of the business. A lot of exploration happening up both sides of the Atlantic. This sort of area up to Greenland seems to be quite sexy. Obviously we've seen the results recently of the Xidias well opening up this new play fairway up to the north of Brazil. Brazil itself, huge potential, both in the subsalt carbonates and the plastics, huge potential, spreading over the transform margin play into West Africa and down into longer-lived play areas, Angola, etc. Fantastic new area opening up in East Africa, as you'll all be aware. Mainly gas at the moment, but some oil potential. Middle East, large, well, very complex area. I'm not really going to deal too much with that, except to note that some of the things happening in carbonates and, if you like, field monitoring on the onshore in particular are taking off in this region. I'm going to ignore Russia for the time being. And then you've got the very complex plays, quite tricky plays of East Asia, and also the sort of basement-related fracture type plays. I'm going to say something about that. And then down to Australia with the huge gas plays in the Triassic, etc., generating huge amounts of LNG potential, and then the Queensland gas, again, I'm not going to say too much about that. So we've kind of got a finger in most of these pies, and where we tend to get involved is in how do I make sense of the data I've got? And that we tend to sort of see it through a prism of start looking at the rocks and the geology and the rock physics, which tends to relate the geology, the geophysics, and the data you have. And these are the guys we do business with. I think most of the friendly faces up there, and some more difficult customers, I have to say. I'm not going to talk too much about that either. Common thing here then, I think you grasped this pretty quickly, is what are we looking for? We're trying to take a more direct approach to exploration, appraisal, and production. So we're trying to see whether we can directly get at the fluids in the reservoirs, which is oil, gas, water, condensate, heavy oils, a huge range of issues there, and that's a big technical ask. But it's becoming possible in some plays. I'm not going to say it's possible in every play. In fractured carbonates, you're really struggling often to see seismic effects can relate to the fluids, but you can do quite a lot to do with the connectivity, the reservoir properties, and even in some time-lapse areas where you stress the reservoir, even some potential for fluid effects. We also want to know where is it, what kind of play is it, what's the capsule, how does this relate? Particularly when you're drilling, you need to know the full numbers of attributes for coming down the well through the overburden, then into the reservoir, and planning that. You need to know all the properties, both static and dynamic. So it's quite a complex process, but it's all heading towards how do rocks behave and how do the fluids in them behave. I think we've all seen the incredible advantages of visualization and, if you like, the IT approach to data integration that we've seen over the years, and I think that's been a real addition. What I'm more concerned with is, if you like, is the scientific core for that. What are the aspects of physics and geology that join, that give you the understanding that you can use in the interpretation approach? Sure, look at it then in a cave or whatever it is, but the more science you have on your side, I think particularly as you deal with more and more complex reservoirs, the better shape you're in. And this is just, I'll go back one. This is kind of an example which I think is quite illustrative. Over the last 10 years, we've seen huge jumps in the technology, in the seismic technology, and also in other geophysical methodologies. FTG, for example, has come up as a really good recon tools in a number of plays. But we've also seen the digital data explosion, and I think this is another aspect I'd just like to get over maybe in passing, is that whereas we used to build models, if you like, the exploration models with a lot of with very little data and a lot of ideas, if you like, a lot of models, that balance is sort of moving over a bit. We've now got much more data. We're getting much more data repeated in the case of field studies and reservoir monitoring. So I think it's always going to be a sort of interaction between how much data we've got and how do we interpret it, and what ideas do we have that we then look for in the data. But it's this rich integration that we're looking for. And the example I've got here is just a standard X-ray. You can see you can't really see very much more than the bones. You get a little ghostly shadow of the flesh over there. And then here's an MRI scan. I had a problem with my shoulder. They do an MRI scan, and then they do tiny little holes to get in there and get in and drain the fluids out, etc. But it's all planned using high definition MRI scans, and I think we're in getting to, in certain plays, getting to that point where you can start to see the flesh, if you like, and start to see the fluids, and that's part of the story here. Here's what I was saying about the 3D workflow. Pick the skeleton, if you like. We've got the structural picture up there. We put it into a reservoir modelling package, and we flesh out what we know through concepts, through field geology, analogues, you name it. I mean, anybody who's been involved in reservoir geology will know the inputs to that. And then you take it into the simulation world, and we see how this model reacts to flow and what the factors are. You change around the barriers, change around the relative permeabilities, and you kind of mess around in this. And this these two bits here become the area where you try and understand the reservoir. It's such a long way back to go and repick the structure, make what you will out of the attributes and bring it back in there. It's very difficult to do this. So this whole approach takes a long time, and that's kind of the picture from, say, 10 years ago, and pretty much to the present day. But I think we're starting to see change. This is kind of a way that we see the world changing currently. It's a diagram that shows, if you like, all these sort of interactive cogs working together, hopefully. So we've got seismic data of various sorts. We've got drilling data, log data, real rocks occasionally. We've got interpretation models, these conceptual models that we use to identify plays and use them to guide our thinking in terms of how we integrate data. And then we've got some upstarts, if you like, coming into this mix, rock physics. I'm not just saying this because it's our primary business, but it's started to be quite a glue, and that word that people use quite often is glue. It's become the glue between the rock physics, is the glue between seismic data, drilling data, and often other aspects of interpretation models. So you've got a much more integrated system here. And the key thing, I think the most exciting thing, and hopefully the case studies show this, is that as you deal with more and more complexity, so you have to iterate between the models to come up with better and more robust understanding. So it's that speed increase, that static approach there. So yes, I'm going to be talking a little bit about dynamic data, but the process itself is becoming dynamic. So first example, rock physics, AVO inversion. I think everybody's seen the all very obscure comet before, or all very obvious. I don't think either of them are particularly true. But here's an example of, this is actually an AVO inversion. It's actually, for the aficionados, it's an EAI inversion mediated by a rock physics model. So we've got a nice model up there. You can see as from the well data, as the porosity increases, we can start to get separation between water, clay, sands, and oil here. So using that kind of model, we calibrate the seismic, and then we visualize it, put it all together, and we get beautiful things like this. And this has been done time and time again in the transform margin play in the Cretaceous, probably a bit deeper than most people expected this kind of science to be very effective in a sort of recon way, largely uncalibrated, not exclusively uncalibrated, but it's working extremely well. And there's a lot of oil yet to find in this kind of play, both sides of the Atlantic, and in analogues around. But so a little bit of rock physics, good quality seismic data, good predictive tool. I think there are regions where we know that doesn't work, and one I'm going to give you a bit of a update on for some work we've been doing is West Shetlands. Bit of a I wouldn't say graveyard of AVO, I mean it's sort of just patchy AVO behaviour. And one of the reasons is it's a more complex basin, and if you're looking at this, it's a little bit of a technical example, but let me just take you through it, is that if you look at the rock properties, and this is just simply a map, it could be almost any elastic property you want to look at, AI versus depth, or EEI versus depth, or what have you. I think you can see that there's a trend, and then there's a dog leg in the trend. And what this is relating is chemical changes in the so not just, if you like, compaction changes that we can handle in geophysics, typically compaction type events, but these are actually chemical changes brought on by fluids and temperature. So a much more complex system. In this particular case, we're getting a smectite to like transformation. There's cementation happening. It's geology. Geology is impacting, the basin geology is impacting on straightforward trends to make it much more difficult when we take this into the seismic domain to make our AVO work. So in this case, and this just shows pretty much the same thing. I think you can see here there's sands on the normal compaction trend here, and then there are some sands, because it's an inverted basin, which have got preserved porosity, and they're very much better exploration targets, if you like, but seem to be at the same depth. But these have been preserved through fluids going in, and these have had the chemical compaction. So just realising that these kind of effects are happening in your basin has a big impact for risking and the kind of weight, if you like, that you put on your AVO story. So in this case, we can take that kind of knowledge and feed it through, very simply, this is an IG plot with all the four AVO classes. And you can see, as you go down through depth, you actually change classes. And you're not just changing class to this so-called AVO floor, which a lot of people have talked about, which is kind of a compaction event. You've also got new processes coming there, chemical processes, which you can identify from the knowledge base that we have in that basin now. So you can modify your AVO plots and reflect that. And it's just, I'm not going to guarantee that this is going to work in 100% of cases. Of course it won't. There's always going to be some unknown unknowns that we factor in here. But I think one thing that you could say about the business is not being quick enough to take on board what's going on in related areas in geology, such as diagenetic stories, and taking the story that's coming out of the stratigraphy, the story that's coming out of the general facies, and bring that in to look at what we're doing in the geophysics. And I think simple examples like this can really help in understanding and therefore in the way that we drill up basins and hopefully the success rates we see. I'm going to give you another example where a geological, what would be thought of as a geological concept being brought in and interacted with, in this case, seismic attribute story, can help, again, understanding. So we've got here an interaction of rocks, pressure, reservoir, and also the fluids. And we use this sort of tagline here: the regional informs the local. Look at your regional data, then focus in and see what that's doing for you on a prospect by prospect basis or in any form of analysis. This is an example from Ormen Lange field, offshore Norway. It's some work that we did on our offshore Norway 2 project, which is currently in finalisation. And it's a simple story, I think. You can see that the field outline, and just to get your eye in, that's a dry well up there up to the sort of north, if you like, and then you've got the producing wells, gas wells, within the body of the field. And you'll see that, okay, there's a sort of high there in the middle, but the bulk of the field actually is sitting in lows and actually draping around the highs. I mean, conventionally you'd think, oh, strap trap. But actually, when you look at the lithology, the reservoir description, or the lithology around the area, it's not a strap trap. You don't see pinch outs to the north. You don't see. You've got a contiguous reservoir. So why is the reservoir in that place? Well, it turns out to be an impact on the oil held within the pores and interacting with the pressure, the regional pressure system. And it's offsetting the oil, which is then having an impact on the seismic attributes. So where you have the seismic attributes is affecting the amplitudes, and that's conventional exploration story. What's new here is that the recognition that it's not an amplitude conformance necessity. So that shibboleth that we've had for a long time of I don't believe the attributes unless they're actually conformant with structure. Again, that can break down. So again, it's a richness idea. It's putting ideas together that have come from another part of the business and just trying to integrate, and you can get greater understanding. This doesn't work everywhere. You've got to understand whether regionally you've got these kind of regional pressure drives working. But if you have, it's something you need to take into account. Here's maybe a simpler way of explaining that map, where we've got this is a field in the central North Sea, in appraisal and development at the moment, where you can see the structural closure. The structural closure this high, and actually implies, if it's full to spill, fairly thin oil column. Now drilling down dip has shown oil 180 metres down dip of closure, and you're getting much larger thicknesses. So You can see if you can recognise these effects and relate them to the attributes. In some cases, you can drill much thicker net pays. It's something to look out for. Conversely, if the flow direction was coming from the other direction, it would push your oil away from you, and you'd be looking at a situation where you have much less. And here's just another case after one of Hugh Dennis's papers when he was at Petro-Canada. Good example from Montrose field where you can see the structural closures here, and that was the original, if you like, drilling plan. But as works progressed, better quality seismic have been acquired, more wells have been drilled. It's been realised that the extent of the oil actually sits well outside closure, and that's due to a flow direction, a general flow direction in the central North Sea, pushing oil from the south, from the thicker, higher pressure areas up to release up into the northeast. Right, time lapse. I mean, it wouldn't be a dynamic talk if we didn't talk about time lapse. I mean, time lapse is probably what most people think of when they think of dynamic geophysics. So the time impact coming in here. We're looking at rocks and fluids interacting both with pressure, saturations, and also the time effect. And I've got a couple sort of fairly. I remember one of the comments actually that David made about when he was setting this up was that we have, and I think we are currently moving away from this sort of phenomenological approach where you do time lapse and you get different amplitude effects, and the amplitude effect is really the main driver, if you like, for understanding the distributions. So it's really all you do with the reservoir in updating the reservoir models. I think it's fair to say, and even these early examples like Foynehaven show quite a lot more complexity than people expected. You've got a tertiary reservoir, it's pretty well connected. You do a repeat seismic survey, and which one are we on there? That's 1993, going through to 1990, 2000. Maybe back up on that just so you've got your eye in a bit. 93, 99, 2000. Lots of changes there, but not all of them necessarily related to very simple things. Not all related just to saturation, for instance. Actually, quite a lot of complex detail. And I think when the reservoir engineers start to see this, there was a great deal of excitement about time lapse, and still is, I think, but for different reasons. But a lot of excitement in the early years that maybe something quite straightforward could be done. Okay, you shoot a new seismic survey, and you get a lot out of it. Good bangs for buck. I think what has been recognised through good quality research around the world, name check for particularly Colin Macbeth's group at the ETLP group up in Heriot Watt, is that there's a lot more going on here. That these changes, when you change fluids in reservoirs and change preservoirs, you quite often get gas coming out of solution. The gas then has a different mobility. It moves around the reservoir in different ways depending on the pressure changes. You've got a very complex situation here. And the reason I put this up there is not to diss time lapse. I think it is an extremely valuable tool and actually becoming much more widespread. It's just that with the very wide spreads of years, I mean, we've got 93, 99, 2000, there's a lot happens within the reservoir between the time lapse effects that we've been looking at today that can't be explained because you're just not looking at the picture quickly enough. And I think that is the hope for permanent reservoir monitoring. There are. I mean, you're getting fluid effects here where I think it's the next example Colin mentioned, which is actually a gas. It's a gas example where you've got. I mean, you can see the A9H. That's a little culmination that was drilled by this well and drained. You've got a lot of changes happening. There's an injector down here which is pushing gas up towards here. You're seeing a lot of changes, and I think the hope with permanent reservoir monitoring is that if you get that time scale down to say 3 to 6 months, the time at which you can integrate the data, we may get a lot more information out of it. I mean, the implied gas movement there is something like 30 metres a day from the injection. I mean, you're not going to see those kind of effects realistically without a much closer repeat time. So I think get the frequency of collection of data up, but also I think the implicit story here is understand, do more modelling, understand the interrelationship between the reservoir model, your geological model, and your geophysical data. Here's just an example which just shows some modelling plus some inversion results for a field in one of the big gas fields in Australia, where lots of complex plans for the field. It's got high CO2, so there's stripping out the CO2, re-injecting it back in. You've got a carbon sequestration program alongside a normal sort of gas production plus condensate stripping. I mean, these are big industrial processes that running a repeat on this sort of every year is probably not going to do you as much benefit as taking a long-term view and getting out far more high definition repeat information, integrating that into your model. So lastly, they're very complex examples, and in the time I've got available, I'm not going to give you a sort of lecture on the complexity of that. But what I am trying to bring out here is that by bringing in more information, you can tackle more of these complex and higher value projects. I mean, with oil at $100 a barrel, if you're looking at making a change from, say, a 30% recovery factor up to about 40, you're talking, for most fields, billions of dollars in net present value. So very high value. These are things that the industry ought to be talking about, the value that we can create and going out there and securing this kind of business. Geomechanics, again, that's bringing another level of dynamic complexity into the story. Stress, to some extent, changing rocks. Rocks are not quite so simple as we think. A very good paper by an ex-BP guy called Tim Harper, who some of you may have heard of, which was kind of cheekily called something like Rocks, Dead or Alive. And I think he showed fairly convincingly to a room full of engineers who'd never thought about rocks before that some of the aspects of rocks actually mimic some aspects of living systems. They can hold memory, if you like. They record the impact of the events that are upon them. And they're not elastic, they're not fully elastic, which straight away screws up one of our major assumptions largely in geophysics. Once you have the imprint of events on them, things are held. One of the tasks, I think, is to uncover that hidden information. And it's not a mystic process. I mean, you can do this using physics and geology and thought, but I think you always have to be aware that there's some kind of unknown out there that perhaps we haven't factored in our sort of theoretical models. So a bit of a plea for, if you like, a sophistication in the thought processes here. So here's an example of a workflow getting a lot of use in unconventionals in this case. What we've got here is a discrete fracture network. This is a synthesis, if you like, of all the data that you can put together in a reservoir to look at the fractures. So it's things at fault scale, it's things at micro scale, it's things at borehole televiewer scale. All the scale sections have been put together and analysis has been done to sort of do smart interpolations. So you can build a model, so you populate it using all the available data. In terms of this, what you really want to know is how the flow works in this kind of environment. So what we're doing is dynamically upscaling the data and simulating the flow. Now, there's no way in the experience that we've had, and we've done a number of pieces of work with people like Golder Associates on this. This never works first time. So again, it's an example of one of these processes where iteration and actually getting that data together, but also moving through the process much quicker, is part of the decision-making process. So you model the flow, you dynamically upscale, you go through possibly the seismic history matching or frac matching, change things, move through again, and iterate. And I've got an example here which seems to be, and let me, I hope this thing doesn't go is just going to do that. Sorry, I haven't set this up properly, but I hope what you can see is, if we get time to maybe do this a few times, is that there's a digital fracture network has been built. We've got real pressures, which are being measured from this well here, this injector well here. And we've got the way that these pressures evolve with time according to, if you like, the hypothesis of the connectivity of that reservoir. So how that reservoir is connected to the rest of this body will determine the shape of that curve. And we're pumping water, I think, in this case, into a carbonate reservoir to see how that works. And we've got time-lapse behaviour, if you like, 500 hours. Now, the end result of this is that the thing didn't work, and that actually, from measurements, the implication is that you've got breakthrough, and it's just not following theory. And that's actually good. That's actually what you want when you're doing this kind of work. You want your initial guess to be somewhere close to a solution. It's a bit like inversion, if you like. You need to be in somewhere in that well of solutions, but chances are you probably won't be too close. You need to iterate around that process, and through that process you'll evolve the idea and come up with better guesses. So, I'm going to make a couple of sort of conclusions from these 4 very different examples, all at slightly different scales. One's exploration, one's appraisal, one's more in the production world, one's possibly even in the storage world if we ever get to carbon capture as a business. This quantitative approach, if you like, that we've started to take over the last 5 or 6 years has sort of been mediated by larger volumes of data, more data, but also a sort of I think an expansion in thinking. I think it's a very rich time to be in geophysics at the moment, and not just because the oil price is good, but also because we do have these new tools which we're going to hear about on the broadband side, on the other aspects of tools coming in, gravity coming in. But it's the integration of that to bring out the geology, which is the critical aspect. And I think we've seen more geology come out of geophysics in the last 5 years than probably the preceding 50 years would be my guess. And I think that's set to continue. I think part of that is the data, if you like. It's the way that we're doing things. It's the platforms, with the computing platforms, the software platforms that we're using, bringing the easy availability of the key science aspects into what we're doing. But I think also there's the recognition that we are dealing with much more complex reservoirs than we thought in the past, partially because of the stage we're at in most basins, but also the plays we're in. But there is a recognition that the geology really has a big impact on the geophysics. So bringing that culture together, if you like, the geology and the engineering and the geophysics, is part of the story. And I think most companies are trying to recognise that in their organisational forms. I have to say, still not entirely there. The number of times you say, you come across people say, I've talked to a geologist about that, or the engineers won't like that, or whatever. There's still lots and lots of gaps. But I think it is slowly improving. And particularly as you look at the newer generations, if you like, I think certainly the people who have come in from master's courses over the last 5-10 years are much more clued up on this integration approach. I mean, most of the people I look around here have probably had to learn it the hard way, put it that way, but it's now actually getting taught in schools in a very satisfactory way. There is actually a wealth also of technology out there that we can bring in that's not yet been integrated. I suspect it is the business of companies like mine to do a bit of that experimentation, see what works and bring it in, and if it does work, then it gets out to the rest of the industry. I think we all know that the risk on R&D has been passed successively over the years from the larger oil companies down to the service sector. That's certainly a trend that we've seen. I see some evidence there is some kind of reversal of that in a small sense. Good God, I think even BP are doing some reservoir research these days, so I hear. But it's something which there needs to be that kind of interaction. You need to have people who you can talk to about new ideas, in companies who understand what it is that you're doing. And I think these results can produce a virtuous cycle of success. But we've got to give ourselves, I mean, this is all a very positive story, and I think it largely is. But there is a kind of reality check here on some of the examples I've shown you haven't come, for example, from most of the carbonate reservoirs in the world. I showed you something up there, but that was a fairly simple example. But carbonates, unconventionals, pre-salt, in fact, a large part of the world where seismic recording, is difficult or expensive. We're just not touching that. But let's look at it positive. There's lots of upside then for what geophysics can do in the future. And I think some of the new recording methods are going to attack some of that, some of the new logistics methods, etc. There's also, I think, significant barriers just in the business. In technical terms, rocks are complex, and these interactions between pressure, saturation, all the sort of elastic properties, all the Fasci's properties. We don't have rock physics models that work for everything yet. I think you can get there to some extent by well data. Given a play, you can analyse it and see what the relationships are. But I think we ultimately we're looking for maybe deeper, more physical and more geological understanding of those trends. The amount of data that we get in the industry, the quality, type, and there's mining that and storing that and mining that, processing that is a huge part of what we do in the industry, and probably forms quite a bit of the paycheck of a number of people in this room. Getting it to the point where it's fit for purpose, I think, is a challenge. I mean, we seem to have moved to a multi-client business, seems to be the preferred one. The obvious problem with a multi-client business is that in order to achieve the best results specifically for your play or for your oil field or whatever, you need a level of interaction between what you know about the field already and what the seismic data is giving you. So that interaction process, I think by definition, is more difficult with multi-client. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that seems to me, if you like, the move away from bespoke doesn't help that. And I think there's also a number of cultural behaviours. I've talked a little bit about education. I think that is improving. But organisation, we still see companies moving between the discipline-led approach and the team approach and alternating those. And I think that seems to be part of management behaviour these days. That's a good thing to keep the business G'd up. But does it really do the best job in terms of what we should be trying to do, which is integrate our information together in the exploration and development teams? I think behaviours, that's a difficult one. How we actually improve the behaviours of businesses. I think there's very much more a culture of learning these days, as most companies have moved towards smaller or more difficult reservoirs. I think we've seen quite a lot of good behaviour, if you like, and certainly the way that the independents in some of the new plays have shared information or published, that's spreading information out into the industry, which is starting to make a big impact on success rates. So that's pretty much the story I had to give. It's a story about, yes, it's technology, but it's also technology in the form of integration. And bringing in some of the better practices in interpretation. So if you've got any questions, I'd be pleased to take them.
Thanks, Martyn. Any questions from anybody? If not, I have one, which is sort of flip side of barriers. Who do you see amongst companies that's really leading the way in oil and gas companies? I don't want you. This isn't a plug for you to mention Tullow. I'm actually thinking more in producing fields and enhanced oil recovery and permanent monitoring. Is there a company that you would? Well, actually, if you've got exploration on one side, one of your pictures is about permanent.
Yeah. Shell on EOR are outstanding. And I think they have a good research program. I mean, you could actually say that about, you know, there are very good things going on in most of the super majors, but not necessarily across the board. I think Shell in deep water is very good. Chevron's got, you know, good research programs going on. Don't tend to hear too much about Exxon, but that's just policy from Exxon. BP, I think, is coming back, very much in that world. Looking at the NOCs, the standout one that everyone mentioned, I guess, is Petrobras. You know, they've developed their own research programs among the years and been very successful. Petronas, also very strong research programs. Slightly smaller scale, Anadarko, BG. Some massively, you know, good things happening there. They're the kind of companies that I think maybe there might be some bias in there. I also see it's amazing actually being in contact with the Canadian business. You know, there's a lot of big companies doing some very interesting things up there, the Huskies and the Nexans and Suncors, which perhaps in this neck of the woods we don't come across very often.
Yeah, and Shell is actually, just as an example, one of the big things of explaining the technology programs.
Yeah, I think part of it has to be communication. I mean, if we're really going to get the good people into the business, we all need to do a much better job of going out there and saying, you know, what we do.
Okay. All right.